Welcome to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist. But mostly, I'm someone who believes the conversations we avoid are the conversations that can set us free. I founded the practice Modern Intimacy, where my team and I help people make sense of the invisible forces driving their desire, their relationships, and their emotional health. This podcast is for people ready to have a more honest relationship with themselves and everyone else. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's pleasure. So here's your invitation to peel back the layers, to get smarter, to get closer, and to get naked. No pressure, no performance, just the real thing. Let me start with a confession. In my years working inside both men's and women's prisons, I've sat across from people who have done some really terrible things. And time after time, I heard them say the same 4 words, often whispered through tears. I had no choice. Now, many people hear that and think, oh, that's a convenient excuse. But what if it's not? What if it's a clinical fact? My guest today has spent nearly 7 years inside prisons as well, listening to women who have killed, maimed, or broken the law in other ways, not because they were monsters, but because they were survivors who ran out of options. She's documented their stories in the harrowing, unforgettable book, Unreasonable Women, 3 stories of violence, imprisonment, and extraordinary survival. Her name is Justine and Dr. She's an investigative journalist who has done what few reporters dare. She sat with the women the legal system has deemed unreasonable and asked a question that most judges never do. What happened to you? So today we're going to talk about what she learned, and we'll talk about the thin, blurry line between victim and perpetrator, and about how the same patterns of coercion, control, and silenced rage that landed these women in prison show up quietly and visibly in relationships, bedrooms, and homes that look nothing like a cell, and might even look a little bit like yours. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The difference between free and incarcerated might just be one bad relationship, one moment of desperation. So stay with us. This isn't just their story. It might be closer to yours than you think. Before we begin, a brief content note. Today's conversation includes discussions of intimate partner violence, coercive control, sexual assault, and incarceration. These are some heavy themes, but we'll handle them with care. And if you need to pause or step away or skip this episode entirely, please take care of yourself and take that space. Your well-being comes first. Justine, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk about your book and to talk about the women's stories that you have taken so much time to articulate and tell with such passion. In the book, you talk about a phrase called criminalized survival. Is that a term that you created?
I did not create it. I first heard of the term criminalized survival, I believe, from the organization Survived and Punished, which advocates for women in prison, survivors in prison, but I actually have not been able to trace where the term first comes from.
It's a phrase that when you hear it, it stops you in your tracks and really makes you think. And there's a sentence in your book that I want to read that brings this to light in such a clear way. You wrote, "Criminalized survival lays bare who is allowed to be violent and who is expected to tolerate that violence." So can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of this phenomenon and how it showed up in the stories over and over again that you heard?
So criminalized survival is, on the most basic level, when people, and usually it's women and girls, take actions to protect themselves against abuse or assault, or protect a loved one, and then they're subsequently arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated, and essentially their story of abuse is erased. They are quickly shifted from a victim, that would be their story of what happened, to a perpetrator. There's no in-between space. And our prisons are really full of criminalized survivors, really stuffed full of them. And so the book is about the issue at large. It's also really about being a woman in America, the experience of women in violence in America. And then it's about three remarkable criminalized survivors, Tanisha, TC, and Gemma, who either currently are or were incarcerated across the United States in Michigan, Missouri, and California.
Your book really does such a beautiful job of illustrating their lives before their incarceration and talking about all of the abuse and the context that created the perfect storm for the moment of the crime that was committed. So I wonder if we can talk a little bit about kind of your genesis for this book. What prompted you to examine this issue more closely and tell these women's stories?
The genesis of the book is when I start to think back, because I get asked this question a bit, then I remember all these other like little starting points. But I would say mainly the reason I wanted to look at this issue across the U.S. Large scale is because I covered the case of Nicole Armando in New York. I don't know if you know about that case. It's a pretty well-known case at this point, but it's the story of Nikki Armando, and she was a young mom in upstate New York in Poughkeepsie, sort of middle-class Seaman community, and she was being abused really severely by her partner. Sexually abused, physically abused for years. She had young kids and couldn't find a safe way out that really worked for her, was going to allow her, she was scared of losing her kids. He was sexually abusing her and putting it on Pornhub on the internet. So he also had all these photographs of her. And she was just really scared that it would be used against her, that her own abuse would be used against her. She was gathering evidence. And at the sort of nadir of that relationship, they had an altercation, which I believe he was planning to kill her. And she, in that moment, fought back. She shot him in the head and fled. And then I began reporting on that story because she was charged with, I don't even know, she was definitely charged with second-degree murder. And she was being prosecuted very harshly. And I basically reported on that story, watched that go down, knew, because I had a lot of access to her side of things, not directly through her, but through supporters of hers. So I really knew this alternate story versus what I saw in the courtroom. And I was kind of blown away by the chasm between what I believed was more or less the true story and what was being presented in the courtroom. Once I saw she was convicted, she was sentenced to 19 years to life. And once I saw that happen to Nikki, who, is conventionally attractive, fits what we want women to do, stay at home with the kids, was a preschool teacher. Once I saw this happen to her, I just thought, how common is this? And the answer is very common, and everybody in the space knew it, but nobody had the data to support it. And so I went in search of it.
You did, and you worked with a researcher at a university and developed, I think, 16 questions that you sent out in survey form to women who had been incarcerated across the country. And I think if I remember right, you got something like 1,000 responses. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, what you were learning from the women who were responding to your survey, what you were even asking them, and how you built their trust?
So, for a professor, she was a professor at Yale at the time. Her name was Tanya Sanchez. She was a political science professor. She just helped me. I think she now she doesn't work at Yale anymore, but she's in California. But she had helped me with some other journalism. I decided to reach out to women and ask them directly because there was no data to show the breadth of this issue, even though anecdotally everyone was saying this is happening everywhere. Prisons are stuffed with criminalized survivors. But it's okay, so where's the proof? And there is none, because even if you were to look at Nikki, her truth is erased by the verdict. So all you would see if you didn't know the story is a murder conviction and an inmate number. So you can't find the data through the state, because through the state, these people don't exist. They can't legally be criminalizing survivors. That's not what they do. So they have to be these cold-blooded killers, these master manipulators. So I decided to write the women directly. It was suggested to me, and I ended up creating this very simple survey. It was very open-ended. It was very much some of it was basic, age, race, where you are. But a lot of it was just tell me about your relationship with the person you're convicted of killing. Tell me about the days leading up to it. Tell me about what you think like contributed to your incarceration. And I got over 1,000 responses. And of those, I didn't interact with everybody. I didn't correspond with everybody, but I corresponded with like a pretty significant chunk of people. I mean, I just wrote to people. I just emailed them because there's prison email systems. And I would say like, are you interested in talking to me a little more? People were by and large very interested. They already answered, so they were interested in sharing their stories. And from there, for the book, I selected 3 women to really focus in on. And those were really many years long relationships of a lot of talking. I mean, it was almost like being a therapist a little bit, I think. I wasn't there, I wasn't acting in that capacity, but I was listening. I was interested. And I think I was reading recently a quote, I forget who said it, but they said that being listened to is so similar to being loved that most people can't tell the difference. Like, which I think is very true. And I think in a way, people, especially people who are never listened to, have been told they're lying all their life. I mean, for everyone, we want to be listened to, but especially people who are, categorically dismissed. So, the 3 women that I spoke with, we just talked a lot for years.
It sounds like they really understood that you cared about their reality, which to your point is something that is not communicated when folks are behind prison walls. It's very common that people's complete identities get erased inside the prison walls. There's a tremendous amount of dehumanization. You said something really important a few seconds ago about how the state, any state, really can't justify punishing victims. So there is often this sort of erasure of the victimization that people have endured that led to the charges that they either were accused of or in fact committed. But I want to talk about how this especially is true for women, because in many ways socially we are conditioned to expect violence from men, but we're not conditioned to expect violence from women. And this is really important because so many women are given harsher sentences than men with similar demographic backgrounds and similar crimes. And I think this is because the public sees people, especially women, who kill or engage in violence as monstrous. It's so contradictory to the idea of what we believe women to be. And when we live in a patriarchy, benevolent sexism would have us believe that women are sort of these damsels in distress. They're just always nurturing and caring and couldn't possibly have the vigor or the virility inside of them to stand up for themselves or to be violent just in the same capacity that men can be. I'm sure you know this to be true. Many listeners know humans are humans, regardless of their gender, and we all have the capacity for violence. But in my work clinically and in the forensic settings, I often saw that people, especially women, were trauma survivors. And I'm curious about how this work shifted your own internal narrative about who deserves sympathy, who deserves rehabilitation, or anything else that might have surprised you in your humanizing of the women who were convicted of pretty horrific crimes.
It's funny how you talk about them, being so punished. It makes me think of, there was this book where I had looked up these old laws, and if you killed your wife, it was like kind of like a thumbs down, but you shouldn't do that. But if you killed your husband, it was considered treason, and you were to be punished as if you killed like a king. And the punishment was being drawn and quartered. And so I can't place where that comes from, but that is like a historical, and it just kind of, I feel like there's a line from that to today of it's like treasonous to kill a man, for a woman to kill a man. I don't know that I had really thought about women in prison at all before I started this project. So to the extent that it like changed how I thought, I don't think I considered them. Really, I don't know that I really thought about it. But I would say that I came away feeling like criminality is largely just a construct, is just the labels put on the women that I report on are kind of silly, tragic for them, but like just sort of, Nikki, for example, who started this, a murderer, considered such because she won on her appeal, but she didn't get commuted. She just got her sentence lowered because she was a survivor of violence. I think, what you say about like the dehumanization, that's so necessary for mass incarceration to work. Because if you humanize people, like you can't possibly justify incarcerating 2.3 million. And once you know anyone's story, it totally shifts. So even any individual story totally shifts like how you think of who's locked away and why we lock them away. I mean, I never saw one wealthy woman, never a person of means, never a person who was supported, not one. It was really just, and Nikki wrote this to me when she was in prison, that it was just like people in a timeout from society. You're bad, you go sit over there. It's not vicious killers in women's prisons particularly.
Certainly there can be women who would meet the criteria for psychopathy. There are those women. And having worked in women's prisons and men's prisons, I agree with you. There are so many women who are there because of the circumstances of their abuse. They were incarcerated for engaging in behavior that was actually them being abused. For example, they were being trafficked and they were brought in on charges related to prostitution or sex work. They didn't have a say in that behavior. They were literally engaging in behavior relevant to their survival and then moved from one abusive context to a prison system, which arguably we could say is also quite abusive psychologically. Their freedom and their volition is eclipsed. And very few get the kind of treatment that they need to really understand the degree of impact of everything that's happened in their lives. I'm curious, in your reporting, what did you notice about how the system treated women differently versus men with identical trauma histories or similar kinds of charges?
Well, I didn't do any comparison. I didn't really look at like men in prison. I just wasn't looking at that. But I would say that I did notice like a lot of similarities in terms of the way that women are prosecuted when they want to land a conviction. And they are prosecuted using like sexist and racist tropes. They are like flattened and made one-dimensional. I think they do this to everybody, but I think women, they use specific like signifiers to a judge or a jury. So Tanisha, who's a Black woman in Michigan, the prosecutor kind of referred to her and her co-defendants as jackals, right? Like in animal terms. Said to the jury, she wasn't living with her children, which wasn't even necessarily true, but like she was a prostitute. She was living a wasted life. It wasn't like accurate. I mean, she was a sex worker at, on and off, but it was such a obvious sort of dog whistle. It was an obvious signifier. Nikki was painted to be a master manipulator. That's what people like, because right, that plays into people's ideas of like the manipulative woman. She's like so hopelessly not manipulative that it's kind of comic when you see this. Gemma, who's another woman in the book who acted in self-defense, but was, in my opinion, acted in self-defense, but was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Missouri. She had a long abuse history, as many of these women do, and that was used against her, the kind of idea that if it was so bad, you would have left. If you didn't leave, it wasn't so bad. And the fact that like you had all of these abusive partners over time, or that you let him abuse you, is not indicative of like a larger issue with men or with violence against women or with our society, but is like down to your individual failings and stupidity. And so you kind of deserve what you get if you stayed with someone. So I would see continuously these, like what they know will play well in terms of what people already primed to think about women, and especially women on trial for something. And I would see that again and again and again. Or the last one would be like TC was a lesbian. She was a co-defendant with her mom, and it was definitely clearly a big part of their conviction had to do with their failure to perform femininity properly.
Or subjugate to men, right? And there might be a fantasy that because of her sexual orientation, that's even more defiance in a patriarchal system.
That's true. Yeah, there's something defiant about all of these women, I guess.
Of course,
Yeah.
in the sense that they're refusing to consciously or unconsciously capitulate to the expectations of subjugation. So you talked about three prongs of a very prolific problem of women being victim blamed, slut shamed in the criminal justice system. And the three prongs that you talked about that really pave the way for that to happen so readily. One, that often the ways women are abused and hurt can be, in your words, quote, objectively bizarre, end quote, and therefore it's easier for people to assume that the women are making it up instead of understanding that, in fact, this is what's happening in the privacy of their homes. The second thing that you mentioned is that victims often have no quote unquote proof, even if they have evidence on their body or photos or videos, because people will explain away evidence of bruising or marks on the body as something that was consented to in a sexual context, which you talked about with, I think, Nikki's case. And the third prong is that it is easier to, this is your language, to devalue a victim than contend with the more powerful abuser. And that quote is so profound. Let's talk a little bit about these three dimensions and how you saw that shaping the cases that played out in this book.
I saw this with a lot of people in prison. And I was watching like couples. Do you ever watch couples therapy with Dr. Orna?
Sometimes.
I don't know.
Sometimes I like to check out after work and not do
Yeah,
that.
fair enough. Anyways, my friend bullied me into watching the last season, and I like sort of binged it. And there's a guy who's been like quite badly abused by his mother, and he's talking about the abuse, and he's like, it was like horrible abuse. And as he was telling his abuse story, I'm like, oh, this is nothing on like the women that have talked to me. And his story is like horrible, but the things that were recounted to me by women in prison, by the women in my book, and it's not a hierarchy or anything, I'm not putting it that way, are so like extreme that even the most like extreme things that people talk about outside of that like don't match what these people have gone through. And I think the repetitive nature of it and the bananas, like the creative things that abusers think of, like just, and I saw it a bunch of times, like kneeling on grits, kneeling on rice, locked in a closet, forced to urinate in a cup, dragged down the stairs, a lot of like sexual violence that's so sort of weird and like hard to envision that it almost like has the effect that it sounds so strange and extreme that people don't even want to say it because they know that it sounds so odd that they'll be considered crazy. And so there's something about like that repeated abuse all of people's lives that almost makes it harder to believe them, because if you haven't lived in that world, it's just objectively so strange what people do. Like the fact that Nikki's partner was really into torture porn and put her on Pornhub with like tied up and said 4 hours of toys and torture tonight. Like how do you know, she sounds nuts if you said that. It's kind of like the Giselle Pellico case out of France. Like if she were just to say, I mean, she had all this proof and they had all this evidence and they took it forward. But if she had just come forward, I think, and said like, my husband of, 50 years who's elderly and beloved has been drugging me and inviting many, many men, dozens, hundreds of men over to rape me while he videotapes it, they would just be like, this lady's crazy. Like, this lady's crazy because it's so weird what he did. So I think that's like a question of believability. In terms of proof, like we know the biggest problems with reporting anything that happens inside the home, and particularly sexual violence, is that everyone can explain it away and there's never any proof. That's the thing about it. It's done behind closed doors. And yes, I think I saw again and again, and even myself, I would find in myself that kind of urge to just leave it be, like side with the status quo. Like if you dismiss the victim as just this kind of like outlier, this kind of bad person who's lying, you really don't have to, first of all, put yourself in her shoes. And you also don't have to contend with larger truths about like who we value and, how much harm we allow to happen to vulnerable people. You don't have to contend with that because you can just say like, actually everything's fine. It's just one crazy lady. And I think we all know in our hearts, like we all intuitively know that it's like no good to be the victim. Like nobody wants to
Right.
believe you, and it's a real pain to go forward, to have to push forward, that there's no easy way. So I think, again, people really would prefer that the victim be lying, because if you can just disregard one person, it's much easier than going after abusers and like larger issues.
Absolutely. The statistics are pretty dire. I think it's only 7 out of every 1,000 sexual violence perpetrators will see a conviction. That's pretty astounding. And most folks don't want to believe that. They don't believe that data. They question that statistic because it's much safer for us as a society to have a fantasy that bad guys get punished and the system works. But it often is very lopsided, and that's not the story that it tells. And so much of what the data tells us is that some people are punished in harsher ways than others. And a lot of that is based around gender and race and other oppressive systemic goings on. And you have something in your book that I just want to read because these statistics are pretty harrowing and they're hard to unknow once you've heard them. You said, this is a culture in which violence against women is allowed to flourish, and it does. 1 in 4 women in the U.S. has been injured by an intimate partner. 1 in 5 has been raped, with 90% of rape victims overall being female. Every 86 seconds, somebody is sexually assaulted. And in the United States, 3 women a day are killed by a partner or ex-partner, a rate that has been rising. 72% of murder-suicides involve an intimate partner. 94% of the victims are female. There's more, but I'll stop there. When we listen to those numbers, I think it really paints a picture of psychological protection, because for many people, this might be their reality. They may know someone, it may be happening to them, may be happening in their own relationship or a previous relationship, and they may have been blamed and not believed and have had to reconcile and internalize blame in order to hold on to the relationships in their lives. That's a survival strategy that many people engage in unconsciously. But when we really look at the data around gender-based violence, male violence against girls and women specifically, it's hard to ignore that there is a pattern that isn't being addressed systemically. And it would require all of us to get real about that to make a sizable shift.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that it is this giant systemic issue. It's so deep, and like with the women in prison that I reported on, there's never any resources on the front end, right? There's never anything. It's always stripped bare. There's nothing enough we can do, even though we know these stats, like, because we do know these stats. These aren't just my stats. These are stats like that are well known. They're readily available. Like I maybe made them in a list, but they're there for the taking. So like, why do we put $182 billion or what? Oh, I speak on correction if I have that wrong, but I think it's $182 billion into like mass incarceration, and there's not ever some chunk of that taken to realistically help women get out of domestic violence relationships, to actually treat trauma, to like educate. I mean, I sort of wish that you wouldn't have to like educate prosecutors, but to educate people in the system a little bit. Like there's never any resources on the front end. It's always just heavily resourced on the back end, and then we just lock people away for obscene sentences, 35 years, and we can pay that. But if you had put in like 1 year worth into her when she needed it, maybe given her housing for 1 year to get out of an abusive relationship, that would have like paid dividends and not left more survivors in the wake. Because these women, particularly women, and that's what's I think quite different than men, is that they're the primary caretakers. So for the most part, when they're removed, the ripple effects are even more severe than when like a man is removed, because the children are scattered often. So yeah, it is such a systemic issue. Though I do think people are shifting their understanding of it bit by bit.
I agree. I think when we look at the last maybe 5 to 10 years, there has been more information out there about how many states utilize a for-profit prison system, And we really do have to look at the ethics of that and question, why is that a profitable system? Who profits from that and why? So if you were given the power to design one intervention, something that was mandatory for all judges, prosecutors, or parole boards, based on what you've learned, what would it be and why?
I feel like this is the kind of thing where you answer and then a day later you're like, I actually came up with the perfect solution, but I didn't know it at the time. God, I'm so unimpressed with prosecutors and judges. And I feel like they are so resistant to changing their ways. I really do. Even when you see the survivors' justice laws coming into effect, even when like people on both sides of the aisle are for them, there'll be like a DA's association there to try to stop them. I don't know if I'm going to be able to come up with like the perfect intervention. I do wish that, I don't think, like obviously women are not a monolith. Some of them lie. People are lying, and they're lying for all sorts of reasons, or obfuscating or telling partial truths. But I think that if people started from a place of belief and then went from there, that would probably be one of the most helpful interventions. Like if there was almost like a requirement to start not from a place of skepticism, but from a place of belief. And from there, you know, do your job, but start from believing what she says and then investigate. I think that would be a pretty helpful, like, required rule.
I think that would be wonderful. And what a seismic shift even just that would offer the whole process for people of all genders and all backgrounds if we started from that place of curiosity and belief. I think in your book you mention a legal, I think the right word is precedent, but I'm not sure, called the reasonable man standard. And you talked about how this came to be, but also how it was designed to be applicable to white men who were property owners and didn't really take into consideration what would be reasonable with other groups of people. Can you maybe break that down a little bit?
So the reasonable man standard was, I think it's used in a lot of different types of law but it's also used in self-defense law. And so the book is called Unreasonable Women because it's a bit of a sarcastic title, but it's basically like when you're on a jury, for example, and somebody claims self-defense, you are supposed to ask yourself, like there's a bunch of questions you're supposed to ask to see if it was self-defense. But one of the questions is like, what would a reasonable person, a reasonable man in the defendant's position have done? So it's a hypothetical, like it's just this hypothetical reasonable person that you're supposed to imagine, knowing what the defendant knew and being in their circumstances. Would this person who is reasonable have envisioned them, have also thought themselves to be in imminent danger? And was it therefore justified that they fought back? But for so long, it was just called a reasonable man. And it was really, I pretty sure, conceived of as the idea of self-defense in terms of like two men at a saloon, like in fisticuffs, you know, of similar size, fighting over like a horse or property or a woman, who knows, you know? Then it was like, was that man reasonable? But there, you know, as time went on, it was shifted to the reasonable person standard, but there's never been a reasonable woman standard. And I think that, especially in cases of straight self-defense, there's a requirement that you were like in imminent danger, and a reasonable person would have thought themselves to be in imminent danger. And I think that that looks very different to someone who's been in a long-term abusive relationship than it does to a man outside a bar. It looks very different to a woman who's been abused repeatedly, who's of a certain size, than it does to a man of the same size fighting in a fist fight. Like, I was talking to somebody recently, and it's like, I don't know who said it, or I listened to it somewhere, but they were like, no woman goes and like fights a man. No woman is like, oh, I'm going to solve this by going and like fighting a man. I mean, it's absurd. So like, you know, but the law is set up in a way that maybe for you to be considered reasonable, you would have to be like in a fist fight with a guy. But of course we know that for the most part, a woman would lose, like, and she'd be dead. Well, then she'd be considered believable victim.
Then she would be a believable
Then she'd be
victim.
believed. Just a little late, though.
She probably would still be blamed, though, in many contexts, because
drove him to it.
or didn't leave, right? Which
Right.
really undermines the reality that many abuse survivors endure, especially in contexts of coercive control, where one, leaving is the most dangerous time for a victim. That is when violence escalates. It's not just something they can do willy-nilly, and when they try, they're often punished, or the risk of threat to their life increases pretty significantly. So just leaving is still one of those lazy clapbacks that I think needs to be retired, because it's not the reality that survivors have available to them more often than not. But I think I would, and maybe this exists, right? I'm not an attorney, so maybe I need to get an attorney on the podcast to learn more about this. But when I think about what might be an interesting intervention, it could be to have this sort of reasonable person standard updated to reflect the realities of people who are in abusive relationships, because the desire and the ability to protect oneself is often very different, and the accessibility of self-protection is very different than someone who is having a one-time incident outside of a saloon, to use your example. The realities are just really different, and what feels reasonable in one context doesn't make sense to someone who's never lived in that context. But certainly it does if you're living it.
You know, they are, I know at least in one state and maybe more, but they are looking into or putting forth actually changes in like what's considered imminent in self-defense law for people in intimate partner violence relationships. So I think that's I don't even know if it's more than one state, but I think that's an interesting little tweak to the law, because that is certainly where a lot of women, because women will kill a man when he's lying down or when he's asleep or otherwise in a like lower position. And could they imminently be in danger? Certainly, maybe. So anyways, there is that, which is sort of similar to what you're suggesting, at least on the books in one state right now.
That's interesting. Okay, thank you for that. I'll have to do a little more research around that. So for people who are not incarcerated, which is the majority of folks who will be listening to this and reading your book, what is the one thing that you really want them to take away from the women's experiences that you've shared?
Well, I really tried hard not to make this like not an eat your vegetables book. So first and foremost, I tried to make it like a very propulsive read that isn't actually, that kind of reads like, in a way, true crime, reads like a novel, so that you can really fall into the stories. I knew it would be like such difficult subject matter that I wanted it to be really readable. So not first and foremost, but maybe like I want people to read it and to get into it, just as a book, because I think stories are the way that we learn to care about larger issues. I think I'd like them to take away like the humanity of the women that I'm writing about. I think they're pretty fully drawn in the book, and I think once, like I know that I myself, for example, the leaving thing that you're talking about, you know, first of all, I realized after the fact that everybody in this book who killed somebody or was involved in a killing was basically trying to leave at the time that it happened, or had left. You know, it was always so, you know, the idea of leaving, it really ends quite poorly. I think that I tried to really put myself and the reader in their shoes. And I think once you're in their shoes, you can see the impossibility of the choices presented to them. And you can see all of the factors working against them that make it impossible for them to get out of the abuse or out of prison or out of the criminal legal system. And I think hopefully it will help, you know, people won't think about these sorts of cases the same anymore. They won't take what's given to them by the state as truth. But I would, yeah, I mean, mainly just the humanity of the women at hand and all they've been through and kind of how remarkable they are. These people hidden away in prisons that are labeled as murderers. But in some ways, I think that they are sort of heroic people, and you wouldn't think so because they're painted as like the villains of our society.
I really appreciate you saying that. When people ask me about my time working in prisons, they ask me what it was like, and I often respond by saying that I got to see the worst of humanity, but also the best of humanity. And I think to your point, there is a lot of healing and growth that can come out of people's time there if they do have the internal or external resources to get there. But I often witnessed really beautiful moments of tenderness and care between people who were incarcerated, and a lot of empathy and sharing their stories, and a lot of just really being seen and witnessed for the first time among their peers. Now, also, there are really horrific things that happen. I'm not trying to paint this as a rainbows and unicorns
like
space.
kumbaya.
Yeah.
Pretty, but yeah.
But there are moments of resilience and moments of post-traumatic growth that can and do occur that I think really speak to the dimensionality of people who are incarcerated. Right? It's easy for society, for us as a society, to think someone did a bad thing, therefore they are bad, let's lock them up, throw away the key, and never think about them again. But the reality is none of us are black and white. And
Right.
most people have the capacity to do something pretty horrific if pushed to their limits. And the thing that I kept thinking as I was reading the book, one of many things, but just that so many of the women's story, they were desperate to feel safe, and they took action to eliminate the biggest threat that they had in their lives and to try to create a life for themselves that was rooted in safety. And when we start to look at people who have engaged in criminal behavior as people who are trying to survive their circumstances, their behavior makes a lot more sense. And it is easier to zoom out and say, what do we as a society have to rethink in how we're setting people up for a life that is one of thriving versus a life that is merely surviving. And I think we all have the ability to affect change in that direction.
And I think the one other thing is, like, as to what you're saying, to see how close we all are, like, we're so interconnected, the idea that these are like these monsters that are locked away, it's really, that's a comforting idea, but it's not true.
It's not.
No, it's like, it could be you, you know, I mean, not to take away people's agency, but that's one thing, like for women in particular, to see how closely connected we are to each other.
Absolutely. Thank you for writing this book and sharing the stories of the women who were willing to have their stories shared. Thank you for bringing this to light and for coming on the show. For folks who want to connect with you or follow your work, where can they reach you?
My website, JustineVDL.com, has all of the links. I'm Justine VDL at TikTok, J Vanderloon on Gmail, and on Threads too, but I forget which one it is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That's our time today. Thank you for joining me and for showing up for yourself. Before we go, a gentle reminder. This podcast is for education and exploration. It's not a substitute for clinical care. If you're ready for more personalized support, my team and I at Modern Intimacy offer free consultations to help you figure out what that could look like. You can go to modernintimacy.com or find the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep getting smarter, getting closer, and getting naked in all the ways that matter to you.